Welcome to A Dram of Outlander. This is Desiree, your podcaster and the writer for ADramOfOutlander.com for all things Outlander, from the Diana Gabaldon book series to the Starz TV series to anything interesting that falls between. This is podcast episode 172, and we are in week 8 of the Fiery Cross read-along, chapters 13 and 14. Before we get started, I just wanted to say, yes, there's been a delay in getting the next podcast out due to some personal things going on and the intensity of my schooling at the moment. So I will have a little bit of break from my online coursework, so I'll be able to catch up a little bit after next week, Monday. Okay, so where did we leave off? We found out that the priest had been jailed, so to speak. He'd been arrested, and that there was some issue over at the barbecue pits, right? And the summary goes something like this. The age-old argument of what makes the best barbecue unfolds. Beans are indeed a magical fruit. Memories endure and bond. Aunt Jocasta is a savvy woman. What makes an honorable man? Jamie makes a confession. A religious event occurs, and marriage cannot wait. We are still at Mount Helicon, North Carolina, late October 1770, with cool, gray, and wet weather. The active characters in these two chapters are Jamie, Claire, Rosamund, Lindsay, Ronnie, Sinclair, Roger, and Brianna. So the first thing that we come across is the great barbecue debate and the memories of Jamaica. This is where Diana Gabaldon is able to pull those threads from past events and remind us, so we don't just get caught up in the current story, whatever we're listening to, whatever we're reading. And the reason that Jamaica is important here is as Claire follows Jamie and comes upon Rosamund, Lindsay's barbecue pit, she's reminded of the pits of Jamaica, where the bodies of the enslaved people that did not live through the voyage from Western Africa to Jamaica, they would be burned. And it's a nauseating smell and memory. But it hits her pretty hard for a moment and brings us back to a different time, reminds us of other things that are going on, reminds us, yes, slavery is a big deal still in their time and place. So here's what Claire says. The sight of the pit was somewhat less appetizing. Clouds of white smoke billowed up from the damp wood, half obscuring a number of shapes that lay upon their smoldering pyres, many of these looking faintly and hair-raisingly human through the haze. It reminded me all too vividly of the charnel pits of Jamaica, where the bodies of slaves who had not survived the rigors of Middle Passage were burned, and I swallowed heavily, trying not to recall the macabre roasting meat smell of those funeral fires. So she's able to stop and identify a memory and connect to it before moving forward. I think that's really interesting about Claire, because oftentimes people are not very grounded in, the present moment. And so when memories come up, it's really easy to just shove them away and not want to think about them. They don't want to look at connections. They don't want to have to revisit things that are uncomfortable. But she revisits it, addresses it, acknowledges it, and then moves forward. So Rosamund Lindsay, was working the barbecue pits, and at issue here is the fact that she's ladling a sauce onto the hog, onto the pig's carcass. And Ronnie Sinclair is flipped out, saying it's poison and that she's ruining the barbecue. Okay, this is still a contentious thing about barbecue across this country. I looked up several different barbecue philosophies, and I put links in the show notes, including the history of nightshades. That was really an issue, is that she's using tomatoes. Oh no, we don't really want to eat tomato leaves, but tomatoes are fine for most people, right? People sort of associate at that time period nightshades with the properties of things like belladonna and other nightshades that could actually poison you and kill you. Well, there's lots of things that fall under the grouping of nightshades, including all different types of peppers, like bell peppers, spicy peppers, tomatoes, and there's a lot of things that fall under that. And I know some people have sensitivities to it, but some of us live on them. That's, I eat all those things routinely, if not daily. And so I did include a variety of information about nightshades, styles of barbecue across the U.S., an in-depth article about barbecue styles, like how did they come about. And Carolinas, especially North Carolina, really has a couple of very serious traditions for barbecue. There's North Carolina and East Carolina in North Carolina. So those are worth clicking on if you're interested in the fascinating topic of barbecue in the United States. It is indeed interesting. So Ronnie Sinclair is just up in arms at the idea that Rosamund is putting this sauce on top of this beautiful pig. And he believes they should only have vinegar on it. And there's this argument that's ensuing, and they were concerned because Rosamund knows how to butcher real well, and she has the ability to butcher anything, not just pigs, that they would get into a fight and she would harm Ronnie. So what was in Rosamund's sauce that was so offensive? Tomatoes, onions, red pepper, and sugar. So it would caramelize on top of the meat. I think it sounds delicious myself, and I would like to eat some. So Jamie's able to sort of take control of the situation as, a laird would have had he been in Scotland, and his people on his land would have been fighting over some type of topic. And this is where we keep seeing the necessity for Jamie to be a leader. He is one who is a peacemaker. He is one who wants to take care of those under his charge. He can't help himself. He is drawn to that role. And people want him in this role. I mean, Joseph Weems came to get him to fix the situation. So in the course of diffusing this situation, we come upon the idea that in Boston, people like to have beans for breakfast. And of course, Claire, in her infinite humor, comes up with the beans, they're good for your heart. The more you eat, the more you fart. The more you fart, the better you feel. So let's have beans for every meal. So she just says it out loud because Claire is sometimes totally socially awkward and says inappropriate things. But in this case, it's really quite funny. Like, this diffused Ronnie Sinclair immediately, and Rosamund, and Jamie starts laughing. And so it totally changed the moment and brought it back down to reality. And Jamie loves this song. Most of us in the U.S. have heard this from childhood at some point or another. But Brianna had brought it home to Claire. And Jamie thinks that Claire should teach it to Roger so he can write it down because it has some great wisdom in it. I think that's really cute. I love how he just rolls with Claire's 20th century isms so quickly, and he finds them fascinating and doesn't think anything of it. You kind of wonder from the outside what others are thinking because she comes up with some odd things. But I'm certain so does Brianna and Roger at this point. So they're this weird trio. So Jamie's able to take Ronnie Sinclair and start moving him away. And they start talking about Gavin Hayes. You remember Gavin Hayes way back? Who was hung for thievery. Well, Jamie brings up a non sequitur here and wonders if Gavin's son knows. And so, yes, Gavin's son does know what happened to his father. And then they have this moment where they're talking and reminded about Ardsmuir. And Jamie wants Ronnie to talk to Gavin's son, and he says, "Tell him how it was for us there in Ardsmuir." Something not quite a smile touched his face as he looked at Ronnie, and I saw an answering softness on Sinclair's face. Jamie's hand tightened on Ronnie's shoulder, then dropped away, and they set off up the hill side by side, the subtleties of barbecue forgotten. How it was for us. I watched them go, linked by the conjuration of that one simple phrase, 5 words that recalled the closeness forged by days and months and years of shared hardship, a kinship close to anyone who had not likewise lived through it. Jamie seldom spoke of Ardsmuir, neither did any of the other men who had come out of it and lived to see the new world here. So Jamie is taking this common thread, as uncomfortable as it is, and pursuing it for something positive. What happened to them? Because maybe it would help Gavin Hayes' son understand his father's plight in the new world after being sent over for many years before he was free. And then by the time he was free, what skills did he have? What could he offer? How could he earn? And it might help his son to simply understand his father a little bit more and ease that pain somewhat. But this also is indicative of things to come in the story. And it's interesting because I have been going back through The Scottish Prisoner again, listening to it when I'm hiking or whatever. And I love how we really get kind of that in-depth viewpoint. Jamie's only, he's 16 years out from it, from Culloden, when The Scottish Prisoner starts. 16 years. And here, he's an additional set of years out, but it's so painful. He doesn't want to remember Culloden. He doesn't want to remember Ardsmuir. And for him to actually bring it up here to Ronnie Sinclair is quite significant because it haunts Jamie. It's not just Blackjack Randall that haunts Jamie. It's the whole uprising. It's hiding in the cave. It's being in that prison. It's being put to hell water when everybody else was sent to the colonies. there's a lot for Jamie that is really tied to this. And it's amazing to me that he brings it up in such a simple and kind gesture to Ronnie for Gavin Hayes' son. So we move from here to the recollection of Roger telling Jocasta off and ceremony talk. Okay, so there's many, many layers to Roger telling Jocasta where to go, as well as why did Jocasta do that? Because we left off thinking she was just this old biddy who wanted to make sure that this grub of a man with no family history was able to get his hands on her money when Brianna wed him. Because in the 20th century, Roger has a history. He has a family. He has the Mackenzie lineage that can go way back to Jocasta's brother Dougal. However, nobody can substantiate that, can they? Only Jamie said he's family. Well, that's not totally enough for Jocasta on one hand. But it goes deeper than that. And I love we get the reveal from Jamie about what currency Roger just bought himself. Because remember, Jocasta had all the families. I mean, she's a massive socialite. Like, she's on the upper rung of the Cape Fear social scene. Okay, she's very powerful. She's got the largest plantation. She has a veritable crap ton of money and influence and power, even as a blind woman in her 60s. She's still able to use her currency for however she wants to. So she made it look like she was being overly protective of her money, overly protective of Brianna and the child, and was calling Roger would-be murderer to get to her money. So she really escalated this in a very sly way. And as we get to go through this part, Claire really wishes she had been there to see Roger lose it on Jocasta and tell her where to stick it. But Roger would not repeat it exactly to Claire, and he says, "It wasn't the sort of thing one ought to say to a woman, let alone an elderly one, and particularly one about to be related to me by marriage. I was just asking Bree whether I maybe ought to go and apologize to Mrs. Cameron before the wedding." Brianna doesn't think he should, and is totally on Roger's side. And so they're coming together as a couple. They're being a united front. However, where we get from there is that this is actually quite a positive thing that Jocasta did. Remember, she is pretty Machiavellian. She's a Mackenzie, and she's very good at it. So she was looking at a variety of things. Yes, she had to make sure she put her interests, her money's interests, Brianna's interests, and Jemmy's interests ahead of Roger. Because on the surface, he has no family name. He could be a charlatan. We don't know. But her underlying reason for that is, after talking to everyone about him, all the who's who, she actually bought him incredible street cred by the fact that he admonished her so deeply, and everyone's going to hear about it. His response, what he did, gives him clout and is actually giving him a secure place by Brianna's side and is Jimmy's dad. So she was very clever. So she seeded one thing that seemingly was really negative, but on the other hand, she just made him a wealthy man in the terms of social standing and status. because everyone is going to hear about what Roger did. And we find out that Roger and Brianna now are having to be married by someone else. So they're going to work on that. It's fine. But Jamie has a whole plan that he is trying to unleash. And while they're having this conversation about the wedding, what happened to Father Kenneth, was Farquhar Campbell behind it, etc., 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 what's going on, Roger has to explain to Jamie that he's not the best person to go talk to Jocasta. And here's what the text says. Blushing fiercely, Roger recounted the substance of his conversation with Jocasta, lowering his voice nearly to the point of inaudibility at the conclusion. We heard it clearly enough, nonetheless. Jamie looked at me. His mouth twitched. Then his shoulders began to shake. I felt the laughter bubble up under my ribs, but it was nothing to Jamie's hilarity. He laughed almost silently, but so hard that tears came to his eyes. "Oh, Christ," he gasped at last. He clutched his side, still wheezing faintly. "God, I sprung a rib, I think." He reached down and took one of my half-dried, clean clouts from a bush, carelessly wiping his face with it. So, after he recovers, he sends Roger to go talk to Farquhar on behalf of Abel McLennan. So, they're trying to get this all worked out. And this is where we get the fullness of explanation of the social clout that Jocasta has afforded Roger. And Jamie's like, "Poor Roger, poor but virtuous. Though to come to that, she's bought the lad something of value as well, hasn't she?" So I love how they're talking about this. I could never play society. At society, I'm thankful I was born just a normal family. It's so much. I would never be good at it. I'd be out. I'd be kicked out if I was born in a society family. They wouldn't know what to do with me. So part of the credibility that situation brought Roger was the fact that he claimed Jeremiah as his own in a very strong way. And then this makes Claire sit back and look at what an honorable man Roger is and how he meant it. And she says, "But the speech of the heart is louder than the words of any oath spoken by lips alone." Then she reflects upon Frank, and this is where what makes an honorable man. Frank had sworn to me that he would keep me as his wife, would treat the coming child as his own, would love me as he had before. All three of those vows his lips and mind had done his best to keep, but his heart in the end had sworn only one. From the moment that he took Brianna in his arms, she was his daughter. And now she goes further because it's a conundrum. But what if there had been another child? I wondered suddenly. It had never been a possibility, but if it had. Remember, Frank was infertile. Slowly, I wiped the teapot dry and wrapped it in a towel, contemplating the vision of that mythical child, the one Frank and I might have had but never did and never would. I laid the wrapped teapot in the chest, gently as though it were a sleeping baby. It's interesting how Frank keeps coming back into the narrative, and he was an honorable man. I know some of you are Frank haters, some of you are Team Frank, and I think there's just so much more to him. We saw really only Claire's vantage point, but there was still love between them. There was a relationship. This is where we need to extricate the show Frank from Book Frank. They're very similar. But Book Frank didn't have, as far as we know, he didn't declare this one honey. He didn't bring her around. He wasn't dating one woman for years and years and years. It was only at the end before he died that he said, he had met someone and he was moving to England. Like, we didn't even know who this person is. And frankly, he could have been lying about it. No pun intended, using frankly. He could have used another woman as a way to ire Claire and cause her to file for divorce. Because throughout the books and her time with Frank, Claire and Frank retained an intimacy. They didn't always have sex. They weren't always on the same page. But they retained an intimacy. They slept in the same bed. They parented together. And they still had this mutual respect and love for each other. And Claire was emotionally distraught that entire time. And she never fully reconnected with Frank. She didn't. And whether or not he had affairs on the side or flings or whatever you want to call them, Claire was not completely available to him. There were parts of her that were isolated and shut off. And those places are what kept her connected to Jamie. Those vivid dreams. And in The Scottish Prisoner that I'm going through, like, Jamie has some very vivid dreams about Claire where he sees her and he hears her and can smell her. And I wonder if those are the dreams that Claire is having in the 20th century at the same time that cause her to cry out his name in her sleep. They stayed connected, and there's nothing that Frank could have done about that. But this is where I think Book Frank has a little more integrity, if that's the correct word, than TV Frank, where he told her, he has this woman and brought her to the house. He had a long-term single-person relationship. And on the TV show, they basically said, we had to take the ambiguity out of it. We had to make a choice. Either he just had quiet flings, basically, that we assumed, or he had something more established that would drive his character. And so they chose to get rid of the ambiguity so that we wouldn't question it. Well, in the book, we question it. We know women were interested in him. We don't really know about affairs. We don't really know that. And, I've always suppositioned that part of what Frank was doing was he was allowing Claire to believe he was seeing other women when he was doing undercover, like that MI5, MI6 work, that he was doing his government work that he never stopped doing since World War II, that he always maintained being a professor and doing those things, but he never stopped his spy work either. So I think there are components to that. And it'll be interesting when Diana Gabaldon writes a Frank book. Like, what does he know? What did he really do? What was his behind the scenes? What was his vantage point? We're going to get a lot of really powerful information. And it will clear up for us whether Frank had affairs or not. And part of me is very sorrowful that they made this line in the sand about Frank in the TV show, because that ambiguity allows us to give Frank the benefit of the doubt. It allows us to think about, what if I was in that situation and I came back to this good man who had his flaws just like I do, and we worked within it. We kept sharing an intimacy. We had a love and respect for each other, but it wasn't easy. And there were parts of us that we held back. That sounds a lot like real life to me. It sounds a lot more real life than Claire allowing Frank to have relationships as long as he was subtle about them, as long as he kept it on the down low. Like, Book Claire would never tell him to go ahead and cheat and just be subtle about it, because they did maintain an intimate connection of parenting, friendship, lover, even though it was strained and difficult. But they did. And in the books, it makes a lot more sense for Claire to continue to wear Frank's ring and to honor the years together and to honor their journey together than it does in the TV show. In the TV show, it doesn't really make sense. What do you think about that? I know Frank is highly controversial, and it challenges people to really step back and think, how would that be? I wouldn't want to live with somebody for 20 years whose heart was closed to me. If I still loved that person and wanted to reclaim the marriage and relationship we had prior and to grow something new and to keep coming up against that wall, it would be really difficult. I can imagine that I would be desperate and lonely and very sad in that situation. And what we saw Frank do in the books is often what women do. It was a role reversal where Frank engaged with their child deeply. He accepted this child as his own, where he worked really hard to maintain certain aspects of the relationship. But yet he bided his time until Brianna was an adult. And he's like, oh, I'm moving to England with my new honey. We're getting married. I want to, like out of left field. I mean, if you remember in the books, they were in bed together. I mean, in their pajamas, but they were in bed together talking, and all of a sudden he springs it on Claire. And it was just out of left field. Claire never would have looked back because she promised she wouldn't. They didn't talk about Jamie. They didn't talk about the past. They did that stiff upper lip thing and started fresh in Boston. So when you're looking at the complexities of that, I mean, that's a huge sucker punch for Claire. And he did something very dramatic to release her so she would go back. She would go back to her true love. And Brianna was old enough to where he didn't fear losing her. And it wouldn't impact Brianna the same as if Claire would have had this release of relationship when Brianna was 7 or 6. When Claire went back to school to become a surgeon. So there's all these things that Frank did. He worked very subtly, and he wove this tapestry to steer Claire back to the past. I mean, remember, he left that false gravestone that they found in the kirkyard. So for everybody who's a Frank hater because he cheated on Claire, well, Claire basically was emotionally cheating on Frank the whole time, and she was jealous. So there was still love there. She was jealous of the phone calls that she perceived as women calling and hanging up. She was jealous of the time he spent away. They still had that connection. And that's what makes them raw and human to us, as we can look at that and go, wow, I could see being in that relationship for 20 years. You make it work. And it's not pretty, and it's not easy, and it's not simple. But they shared Brianna, and he laid a framework and a groundwork for something more. And as we go through the books, we really get to see what that means over time. What he really did in his contributions. So I think Frank is really an unsung hero in the books. And he's really fascinating. I think he's fascinating more outside of his marriage to Claire. I think it just showed his character and who he was overall. And good people do things that you may not agree with. People with good character may do things for lots of reasons that you may not agree with. And I'm somebody who is the most highly monogamous individual on the planet, as is my husband, thankfully. But I could see if you're in an emotionally crippling marriage like that, if expectations are never met again. You know, what Claire was saying, that of the things that he said that he would love her the same and their life would go back. She couldn't commit to those oaths either, but his heart committed to Brianna, and that was the most important factor. It wasn't that they had this glorious, perfect marriage. It wasn't all the things that you could name. It was the fact that they supported each other. He supported her, though he didn't understand her need to go to medical school and become a surgeon. He supported her long hours. He did the things that so many wives do. That is where Frank shines. That's where we see who he really is in those little things over time. And I really do think that the TV show writers did Frank a huge disservice in how they portrayed his support or lack of support and how he and Claire actually worked together. We really didn't get to see a lot of that. What we saw was a lot of ire between them, but we didn't get to see the day-to-day courtesies, really. We didn't get to see how well they functioned. I mean, and they put them in separate beds in the same room. So there was this stark, deep cut in the intimacy that lingered in the books that was fairly severed in the TV show. So, as character development goes, Frank is someone that in the books you have to really pay attention for, and you can't just skip over those parts, because when you do get to bigger things, where like Brianna finds a letter or something else, or we find out more history of what he really knew, or like Roger sharing that letter to Jamie and then sharing it to Claire and to Brianna, is that you miss him if you just gloss over it as you go. And he's really important. And I hope that even if you kind of came into this still not liking Frank very much, that I've compelled you even slightly to look at him differently outside of Claire. Just look at him and think, in this situation, what would I do? Really, would you have trained your daughter to be outdoorsy and to hunt and fish and use a gun and to be able to do all these incredible things? Why would Frank be that person? He didn't hunt. He didn't do those things. He taught her how to do all these skills just in case she would go to the past. Because he knew. I mean, that is a pretty rockin' dad. He was amazing. And he kept his eye on a prize, even though Claire was mad at him a lot, and Claire accused him of cheating and all of the things. And he wasn't perfect, but he really stayed a course, regardless of how it made him look. I think that is super impressive. And that is really kind of the grit that people in our own life that we appreciate. That's what we do. Because we sit back and think, gosh, could I be that person who's an unsung hero to someone? Could I do something and eat crow for years? Or just go, yeah, never say, no, I wasn't cheating, but never say you weren't? And to sit there and cover up all your activities under Claire's assumptions. That's where it gets really interesting. It's assumptions. Are we assuming about who he is and what makes an honorable man? So Roger is an honorable man. And again, I think on the show they did him a grave disservice by having him actually leave Brianna after their initial wedding night. And so she could get caught up by Stephen Bonnet in the way that they set it up and be raped. He looked callous and unprotective and weak. And I don't like that characterization of Roger Mackenzie. Roger is something of a flower in bloom. And we're getting to see his power come to him because he really is a historian out of water. He's a fish out of water here. He has no training. He has no skill. He has no ability except to meet people where they are, which is a huge ability. But you don't really see it as a value until we move further into the story and see what he's really made of. And so he's kind of blossoming in front of us, and we're seeing this integrity come out. And we can really enjoy the growth of Roger. It's like Brianna had to go through a big growth and not be seen as a single child brat and just be headstrong for the reasons of being headstrong and for being shocked into this reality when she found out about Frank and Jamie and all the things. And so they're both on these journeys, and now they're coming together to be a united front. So I know that was a very long tangent about Honor and Frank. And sometimes I write something down and then it goes into a completely different place. But I just feel really passionate about Frank and really about the core of him. And I do look forward to learning more. And also about understanding Roger better. We got to stop looking at him through the lens of the 21st century. He's a mid to late, he's a mid 20th century man. And he's actually very open, much like Jamie, but there's a huge traditional streak to him. And tradition isn't a bad thing, but there's order to him. And all of the things are challenging what he knows and does. He obviously loves Brianna, who's not traditional in the normal sense that you think. But like Claire, she's full of conundrums and twists and turns that you don't expect. Like she wanted to be a virgin when she got married. That was her call. That wasn't Roger's. She wanted to wait until it was meaningful. That was her. And she didn't want to be married just because of a baby, which you're like, okay, that's not very traditional, because she wanted to make sure there was more to it. She wanted to have a grounded marriage. She wanted to make sure that it was real before committing to something, because committing is really important to her, just like Roger. So there's a lot of tradition to her, just like Claire. And it's really funny because inside of Claire's relationship, it's like lots goes. There's a thread on the Drum of Outlander group talking about how Claire and Jamie have this physicality in sex that is really uncomfortable for a lot of us. I mean, it can be really rough and tumble. And for me, that causes the hair on my neck to stand up. And that kind of demonstration is hard for me to read. It's difficult for me to sit with and go like, wow. But at the same time, I can see the purpose to it in relation to these characters. But the funny thing about Claire, kind of everything, like so much goes sexually, and she's very open with Jamie, and she was open with Frank, is the fact that inside of the confines of that committed marriage, in that vulnerable relationship, and she's a total open book. Anything goes. She's really adventurous. But if you step back and look at Claire in the sense of culture, she's very prudish. It shocks her what other people do. I mean, she's non-judgmental in a lot of ways when it comes to like dealing with prostitutes and the realities of society. She can take a very clinical point of view. And it appears that she's really open. She's not, though. At heart, Claire is a traditionalist. And she does things in the way she does them because it's how she does them. There's no great agenda. She's not an activist. She's just living her life. And if it changes the way that women are perceived, if it changes the way that women function in society, so be it. But she doesn't really care. She's not doing it for other women. She's doing it for Claire. And Brianna is much the same way. They're not really like trying to be trailblazers for other people. This is just how they're wired to live life. Just like Jamie's wired to live life and be more open, partly because of his vast education. But he's very accepting of who people are, even if he has his biases. And inside his relationship with Claire, he's extra open about who she is. And outside of that relationship, he definitely has some hard boundaries and edges, and he has to fight that bias and judgment. So everyone's not just kind of one dimension. And that's why we love these characters, because sometimes they frustrate us and it gets really hard to get inside of them. And we want to put our 21st century, oh, this is a feminist. Claire's not a feminist. She's not. She just does what she wants. She lives how she wants. And yes, and hopefully it sprinkles down to other women. But that's not ever what her root is. You're not going to go see her marching on something in the colonies. She will do her thing to subtly make changes. She will meet the individual where they're at and try to improve their life right there with what she can do. But she's not trying to save the world. So we have to be very careful about not putting that baggage and those claims on these characters. There are gay characters in these books because there are gay people in real life, or homosexuals. Whatever word that you want to use for it, because they exist in real life, just like there are the very poor and there are the very wealthy. And there are those who are extremely smart and savvy and those who aren't so smart and savvy. So you have the whole range of people in these books because the whole range of people and experiences exist. But I don't ever try and put agendas or an advancement of activism in these books because I don't think that there are. And you may not agree with me, but I don't think that every little nod to something means something huge and powerful, even though I love looking at the details and figuring out why it's there. I don't necessarily think that John's brother knows. He doesn't consciously know he's gay. That would have caused a lot of problems. For there to be a conscious acknowledgement that his brother prefers men sexually. It probably gave everybody a big sigh of relief when John married Isabel. And that's how we got William as his stepson. Because there was probably those thoughts and the perhaps, but it probably was never discussed out loud. Like when John went to Ardsmuir. There were whisperings, but it wasn't talked about in polite society. So they were able to kind of skip over it. But people have always existed in this world. And it's kind of like there's nothing new under the sun. There's just exposure under the sun. So I don't think that any of these things are really to beat any drums. We're just seeing the characteristics of real people play out in the characters that we love. And they're very complicated. And they're difficult to pin down sometimes because as people, we're very difficult to pin down. And as we go through and grow as humans, we make mistakes. We make some very solid choices. And sometimes we hurt people, and sometimes we bless people. And sometimes what we do seems very incongruous to how we live our life or what we believe in. And I really think for the most part, there's always really deep reasons for that. And that's why I love these books, because these characters have deep reasons for doing things. And they have very personal reasons for doing things. And it's not so much selfish as in people are trying to live their life and get from A to B to C to D. Everyone's not beating a drum and trying to change the world. All right. So as we move from here, we learn where the priest is being jailed. And the plan is firmly hatched. So Jamie's goal is to get his grandchildren baptized. If the priest cannot marry Roger and Brianna, if the priest cannot marry Jocasta, if this guy's in jail because he can't practice Catholicism in North Carolina at that time, he's going to hatch a plan to get his grandbabies baptized by a priest. Go, Grandpa. I totally understand this. And it's something about Jamie that's really, really important. He is a man of deep faith. And it's important to him to be purposeful. And who knows when they would come across another priest. This priest came from what? Philadelphia? So it came from far away. And to him, it's not the same to have a Presbyterian baptize his grandchildren. So they end up hatching a thing. Like Claire goes to the tent where he's being held and claims he needs his medicine. She just gives him whiskey because he's ill. And so they get this whole thing. And then Jamie wants to get his confession heard. And it is hilarious, his confession. And so the person guarding him, they kind of get the tent to themselves. They go away for a while so Jamie can say confession. And so this is being viewed as, it's not really a Catholic act, so to speak. They're not doing anything like baptizing or performing a wedding. So this is just a service, and there should be nothing against it. And so as Jamie's going through and doing his confession, oh my gosh, it is so funny. He starts recalling Claire churning butter. And because Claire hears it, and she's like, oh my gosh, she's describing me and my butter churn. And this is where she's very private. And it's hilarious how she responds to Jamie describing his thoughts about this woman. And prior to this, there was this conversation amongst those holding the priest about transubstantiation. And so I actually put some links in about transubstantiation and Catholic liturgy for those of you who aren't Catholic. And this is one of the things that greatly separates those who follow Catholicism and those who are Protestant, in how when you're partaking in the bread and the wine, does it literally become the body of Christ and the blood of Christ? Does it transform or does it not? Is it symbolic? I mean, that's bare nuts and bolts, okay? So please don't yell at me. I'm not going to get into massive like liturgy and philosophy and theology. But there's this big conversation about it in this chapter. And I really don't think that much of this will be in the TV show. They may show them sneaking the children in to be baptized, partly because it's really funny, and to have Jamie start with this really awesome confession, and then they move away from there as the kids get baptized. It could be a very quick couple of minutes, but it's probably not going to be as detailed if they include it with the amount of, gosh, it's pages and pages and pages. But so they end up sneaking the children in. Marcelly's been waiting. And they get all the grandchildren baptized. And it's really adorable how they go about it. But here's how Jamie describes the butter churn. Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. I have been guilty of the sins of lust and impurity, both in thought and in my flesh. Oh, to be sure, said Father Kenneth. He's trying to say it loud because they're playing it up. And so the priest asks what form the sins of impurity took. I've looked upon women with lust, to be starting with. How many occasions? Oh, make it 100 at least. It's been a time since I was last to confession. Did you need to know which women, Father, or only what it was I thought of doing to them? So he brings up the butter churn now. Oh no, Father, it was a barrel churn, the sort that lies on its side, aye, with the wee handle to turn. Well, it's only that she was working the churn with great vigour, and the laces of her bodice undone so that her breasts wobbled to and fro, and the cloth clinging to her with the sweat of her work. Now the churn was just the right height and curved, aye, so as make me thinking of bending her across it and lifting her skirts, and here's Claire. My mouth opened involuntarily in shock. That was my bodice he was describing, my breasts and my butter churn, to say nothing of my skirts. I remembered that particular occasion quite vividly, and if it had started with an impure thought, it certainly hadn't stopped there. So she's horrified. It's so cute. Anyway, so they get through that part. The children come in, including Brianna, and they go through the baptism. And I really think it's adorable that this was his utmost reason for wanting the priest there. The marriages were important, but the baptism to him was complete. And here's how the baptism went. The Holy Chrism. Thank the Virgin Mother that I had it on my person. The sheriff took the box with my mass things. Fire, chrism, water of a sort, and a child. Very well, then. You and your husband will stand as godparents to him, I suppose, Mum. This was addressed to me, Jamie having gone to take up a station by the tent flap. For all of them, Father. Hold still, darling, just for a moment. So this is Germain going first. So the priest switches to Latin, and he pushes back Germain's blonde hair, and his thumb flicked deftly over forehead, lips, and then diving under the boy's gown in a gesture that made Germain double up and giggle's heart in the sign of the cross. And the words he said, on behalf of this child, do you renounce Satan and all his works? I do. And now they're on edge here, because he's definitely doing a ceremony, and they're waiting for the men to come back. Do you believe in one God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost? And then, in order for expediency, decide to take all the answers for all the children at the same time. I baptize thee, Germain Alexander Claudel Mackenzie Fraser, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. And Germain, of course, has something very funny to say, but then they go through the children. And when they get to the baby Joan, I baptize thee, Joan Leary Claire Fraser. Claire did not know that Joan was named for her as well. It's very sweet. And one of the funny things that happened is the baby squawks. And they're all worried about it, and Marcelly basically said that you want to make a baby scream so evil cannot get into them. So the task was at hand. They got out just in time. And Jamie is very happy that he was able to accomplish this task, and it took a lot of effort and a lot of work by all of them. So then Claire decides to talk to him about Jamie's confession. And he was like, I couldn't confess to theft or buggery. Oh my gosh. And then Sinclair says, oh, so you think he'd be put off by sodomy, but he'd consider your attitude toward women in wet chemises just a minor flaw of character? And he wants her to simmer down. This is where they have such a cute give and take. There's this humor and this sarcasm that I love. Keep your voice down, Sassenach. You didn't want the bairns to hear you. Besides, it's not all women, only the ones with lovely round arses. He let go my hand and patted my backside familiarly, showing remarkable accuracy in the darkness. I wouldn't cross the road to see a scrawny woman if she were stark naked and dripping wet. As for Lily-White, he may be Protestant, Sassenach, but he's still a man. Oh, they're so funny. And then we move toward the end of this, where there's some more things going on, and they're talking about Protestants and their penises, whatever. But they were able to secure a Protestant minister to marry Brianna and Roger. So we're kind of going through this whole set of things, and there's lots of other circumstances happening. But that's really the bottom line of it. And we did get, in the process of all these conversations, Jemmy's full name, Jeremiah Alexander Ian Fraser Mackenzie. That's a very nice name. Roger wanted Jeremiah, but Brianna was able to come up with the names on her own. So now they're coming up with their conspiracy theory as to why the priest was really arrested. What was the reason? Why were they trying to block these marriages, maybe? Did it have something to do with Jocasta getting married? So they're trying to figure out if there's something that they didn't want getting out, or someone's confession not being heard, perhaps blackmail. So there's still the question surrounding why exactly. So at Roger and Brianna's wedding, everyone is kind of in this moment of memory. And who doesn't love a wedding, really? Even though it kind of puts Jamie off because it's a Protestant wedding, like he's never really seen much of it. And he's really struggling to sit there and have a smile on his face. And Claire's like, it is a respectable Christian wedding, like move along. And Germain's like, is this the bad priest? That kid is hilarious. And there's this scene where Jamie just plasters on this fake smile, and it is really quite funny. And so Claire's trying to smooth things over and trying to get Jamie to come into line. And as the service starts, Jamie begins to relax because we hear, "Dearly beloved, we are assembled here in the presence of God." Okay, so it's not this crazy out-of-the-box thing. And as we're going through this, Claire sends a prayer for young Ian. It says, "Let us therefore reverently remember that God has established and sanctified marriage for the welfare and happiness of mankind." Opening them, I saw that all eyes now were focused on Roger and Brianna, who stood facing each other, hands entwined. They were a handsome pair, nearly of a height, she bright and he dark like a photograph and its negative. Their faces were nothing alike, and yet both had the bold bones and clean curves that were their joint legacy from the clan Mackenzie. I glanced across the fire to see the same echo of bone and flesh in Jocasta, tall and handsome. See echo in the bone. Usually in a different book, we see a foreshadow of a title of another book. Her blind face turned in absorption toward the sound of the minister's voice. As I watched, I saw her hand reach out and rest on Duncan's arm, the long white fingers gently squeeze. The Reverend Caldwell had kindly offered to perform their marriage as well, but Jocasta had refused, wishing to wait for a Catholic ceremony. She was not in a great hurry. By his apostles, he has instructed those who enter into this relation to cherish a mutual esteem and love. I charge you both before the great God, the searcher of all hearts, and if either of you know any reason why you may not lawfully be joined together in marriage, you do now confess it. For be well assured that if any persons are joined together otherwise, then as God's word allows, their union is not blessed by him. Roger Jeremiah, wilt thou have this woman to be thy wife, and wilt thou pledge thy troth to her in all love and honor, in all duty and service, in all faith and tenderness, to live with her and cherish her according to the ordinance of God, in the holy bond of marriage? I will. And Marceline sighed with a dreamy look on her face. Then Fergus kissed her brow. I will, said Brianna. Who giveth this woman to be married to this man? Oh, I do, to be sure, Jamie said. Oh, and this made Claire think about her own weddings. And was Jocasta thinking about hers? And we hear, I, Roger Jeremiah, take thee, Brianna Ellen, to be my wedded wife. The light of memory shone on most of the faces around the fire. The bugs stood close together, looking at each other with identical gazes of soft devotion. Mr. Weems, standing by his daughter, bowed his head and closed his eyes, a look of mingled joy and sadness on his face, no doubt thinking of his own wife, dead these many years, in plenty and in want, in joy and in sorrow, in sickness and in health. Jamie reached across and took my right hand in his fingers linking with mine, and the silver of my ring shone red in the glow of the flames. I looked up into his face and saw the promise spoken in his eyes as it was mine, as long as we both shall live. So good. Who doesn't love a wedding? Okay, I am a total sap. I love watching wedding dress shows, and I love a wedding. And I try very hard because there's a super realistic side of me. I always think of myself as an optimistic realist, and then it makes me sad that half of all the marriages that I attend are probably going to end up in divorce for some reason at some time. But who doesn't love the optimism and the promise of a marriage? Like, I think it's fantastic. And I know there are a lot of people who think that marriage as it stands is outmoded and outdated. I think as I've sat and really pondered these kind of questions, and I look at the motivation of marriage, and I don't think that marriage is necessarily a state-sanctioned event. I think it is an event sanctioned by somebody's faith beliefs, their personal beliefs, and between them and the other person. I think that commitment covenant comes from the two people. It doesn't come from a pastor or a priest or any sort of religious leader. That's how I view it. And I don't think the state really should have anything to say about marriage at all. But when we are having small children, if we are having children, by the state, it serves as a protective mechanism, oftentimes, for the women and the children. Once your children are grown or you're no longer having them, when you say have two adults like Duncan and Jocasta, they need to have a legally binding marriage because of the laws of the land there. But they could have made a commitment to each other. And that would have been, to me, as equally binding, because what binds the state are the laws. What binds the people are their commitment. It has nothing to do with the laws. So that covenant, that commitment, really has to come from the people as the source. And whether it's founded in religion or in secular beliefs or whatever, being in love, whatever it is, the power in it does not come from the state. The power in it comes from the people who are getting married and the reason they're getting married. And there's vast amounts of reasons for people to be married, not just romantic love, which we like to think of now, but there is a sense of protection and security. And men who are in decent marriages, are in overall healthy marriages, live longer. They thrive. Now, studies would show something a little bit different for women, that women often don't do as well. But I think that has to do with the construct of marriage and how it plays out in their personal life. Are they the one who's carrying the vast majority of burden for caretaking the children, the home, their life, right? If the woman is burdened with everything on her own, there's a huge inequality there. And going and earning money is great, but that's not what makes a marriage, a home, a family, right? And as society has really shifted, and women, by and large, are working just as much outside of the home or have an established career, even if they're working from home, that burden has to be shared. It cannot be one-sided. And I think as our society has changed, like in the 18th century, like if the men were out building the houses and digging the holes and doing all the big things, and the woman was tending to the household, they both had very grueling jobs. And as we kind of transferred into a more modern society where we have all these things that are supposed to make our life easier and more convenient, the transition for both men and women really didn't happen readily. Women were still doing, and many are still doing, the bulk of the work outside of a job. I will say it's pretty tough doing a lot of different jobs. I mean, it's stressful. It's emotionally stressful. It is, but they're not real physically taxing anymore. I mean, I personally know ranchers and farmers. That's like work, right? And it's different. They have a different sense about them. And there's kind of a different quality about them than somebody who goes to work for 40, 45 hours a week and is like, I'm exhausted. I just need to sit and like have you take care of me. No, your wife is not your mother, you know? And a mother's job is to prepare their children for adulthood. So I think that is really the issue when it comes to women not thriving as much in marriage, is because that part of traditional relationship we haven't really worked out with the vast changes in our society and in our culture, and that the burden really needs to be shared differently, because I think it may have been shared more equitably when both were working as equally hard. It's just different tasks. But now women are in the workplace for the most part, but yet they're still responsible for the bulk of the child rearing, all the family commitments, everything functioning, and the home staying, tidy and running. And that's where a lot of that inequality comes into it. It's really difficult. And there's a lot of dissatisfaction. I have zero understanding of a man who has no idea how to cook for himself. I mean, you don't have to like to cook. A lot of people don't like to do it, but it's a necessity. So you're just not going to feed yourself if your wife's not around? Like, what? Like, I don't even understand that. Or you don't understand, like, swishing a toilet. If you made it dirty, clean it up. Or you're not going to do dishes because it's somebody else's work because you went to work today. Well, your wife probably went to work too. And even if she doesn't have a paying job, she went to work. But her work is 24/7. It's not you clock in and clock out. And I think that that's where we come into some of the issues with what we look at as traditional. Anyway, got off on another tangent, so my apologies. But I do love a wedding, and I love the promise, and I love the hope. And really, there is something incredibly beautiful about a functioning, healthy relationship. Now, they're going to go through their ups and downs, and there's periods in all of our lives, especially if you've been with your partner for a long time, that there are times where it's not healthy and you guys are growing at different rates and you want different things. But there's something so satisfying and so grounding when you come back to those places of mutual connection and agreement. My husband and I are in 25 years this year, and I'd look at that and go, that is a long time. And on one hand, it feels like a blink. And on the other hand, it feels like a journey. But we keep coming back to places, and I stay grounded in what our roots are and why we're here. And just because our baby is 17 and a half years old almost, doesn't mean that we're only in it for the kids, right? Like, we're in it for our relationship, and we have worked on that over the years, and it's not perfect at all. We still have very different ways of doing things. We have different philosophies. We have different understandings. And as we grow as humans and we uncover trauma and history and discover things about ourselves, we have to do a reset and we have to relearn the other person. I think that's one of the most rewarding parts of being married and being in something that is considered healthy, is that we have the opportunity to do that. And every small thing doesn't set us down the path of not wanting to be together. Because we have a strong foundation, and it's been tested over the years. I will definitely say that. And I really believe that that's why we come back to, like, Roger and Brianna's marriage. They've been heavily tested, right? And they've come together, and now they're a unified front, and they had to go through a lot to get there. There was no storybook romance. This wasn't something pretty and fairy tale. Like, they really got worked. They really did. And then you look at Claire and Jamie's relationship, and Claire and Frank, and it was trials, lots of trials, and necessity, ultimately. But then in Claire and Jamie's case, they can be 100% ultimately vulnerable with each other. They found their person to be completely naked and transparent in front of. They found the person that they could trust undoubtedly with themselves, all of themselves. And if you can find that, don't let go of it. Don't let petty crap get in between it. But that's why we love these characters. We see them struggle and fight and scrape and hurt. And yet they come out of the other side, but we get to see the grit in the process. And to me, that it's hopeful. And it gives me a sense of, yeah, we can do it. It fortifies my position. And really, fiction, should it do that? I don't know, but somehow these books do that. Somehow these books are good kind of primers for relationships in life. And that they don't have to be one way. They don't have to fit a certain mold to be productive and positive. Even Frank and Claire's marriage, when she returned, pregnant with Brianna, it went to its own drummer, but it worked. Yes, it was necessary. And yes, there was a love and there was respect there. Even if it was a fight and it wasn't pretty. And it wasn't what Frank had hoped for. And Claire didn't have certain things to offer anymore. That part of her was spoken for. But there's purpose to it. And it doesn't look like something that's comfortable and peaceful all the time, though they found comfort and peace and purpose in it. So that's why I think we always come back to these books and we're like, oh, I love a wedding. And Roger and Brianna's trials aren't over, but they've been through so much and come through the fire that really from here, up is the only place they have, really. And there's going to be bumps, and just like Fergus and Marcelly, they've been through trials. And she's married to a one-handed man, which is difficult in the 18th century. So we look at these relationships, and Diane is able to write them with such reality and such a clear vision of what humans are like that I think it helps us be a little more gracious and merciful to ourselves, because we can't love these flawed characters to our core, to their core. We can't love them with this ferocity, unless we can actually examine ourselves and maybe love ourselves a little bit in our flaws and step back and say, what do I want from this world? How do I want to interact with people? So we can really take these chapters and sort of have a mindfulness script of our own. What's the purpose? Where am I going? Am I being treated well? I've known of people who have left relationships after reading these books because they realize it's not what they want. There's something better out there, because these kind of relationships exist in the real world. They do exist. And when I think it's realized through this loving fiction that, and you turn it into reality, I've seen amazing things come from the Outlander books. People finding the love of their life and finding these relationships that they just won't settle for. I mean, they know what they want. They know how they want to be treated. They know how they want to connect with another person. And they do. They find it. And I hope that for everyone. And it's not overly romanticized, because this isn't simple. Anything in the Outlander books is simple. Okay. Well, I've yammered on for a long time. You can tell I haven't seen you guys or spoken to you guys in a couple of weeks. So it's a little bit of bonus extra. And I'm going to do my best to record 2 episodes this week. I have some serious schoolwork to be done, and it's one of my children's birthdays today. So I have to get on to that now as well. And I thank you so much for listening. And I want to give a shout out to Jan K for sending me a little financial support. And to me, it's a really substantial offering just so I can keep things going. And basically what she sent me will help pay for 6 months of the website, or it will pay for 3 months of my service that I go through to post the podcast. So I thank you so much, Jan. I appreciate you. And it really kind of moved me to some tears that you would take the time and energy and to support me financially. It's amazing. And I can't do this without you guys at this point. Without listeners, there's no reason to record this podcast. And without financial support, it's really difficult to keep running. Because I am a solo podcaster, I have not taken advertising. That is something I'm open to, but I haven't done it yet. And I really like to keep the purity of what I'm doing. So I thank you very much. And I thank you for all of you who financially support the podcast through patreon.com/A Dram of Outlander. You make a difference, every single dollar. And I'm working on getting you guys some promotional items. It's been a whirlwind just with my midwifery work, family, and school. And I'm hoping to catch a breath so I can follow through on some of the things I want to be able to do for you. Oh, and I do want to make an announcement. The fan panel will be back at the Denver Comic-Con this year. We will be doing the Outlandishly Outlander fan panel with Outlander behind the scenes and Outlander medicine. So Courtney, Karen, and I are planning on being there, and it's the weekend of May 31st. I'm not sure what time we're on or which day we're on, because when the schedule comes out, that's when we know. So I'm super excited and looking forward to doing that again this year. I feel really honored that we got picked because they get thousands and thousands of sessions that people send in, and they apply for one of the few slots that are really available in those 3 days. So I'm really excited that we get to go back there, and it's now called Denver Pop Culture. So we're very excited, and I thank you for listening, and I look forward to your feedback, and I want to know what you think about this stuff and my tirades today. And I just thank you for staying the course. I do my best to go every week, and sometimes I get slipped up and I have to catch up, just like the rest of y'all in life. So I thank you so much for listening, and until next time, Slán Java.